No question about that.
Okay, let's talk about the free trade deal with the U.S. You raised Obama. Are we making any headway there, do you think?
Well, I don't think we can do anything. I mean, they're not going to concede on anything. The Americans pulled out of the deal with South Korea. They said it was too hard, and that was pressure from the American motor companies. So, if you can't get a free trade agreement, Americans walk away from that. With New Zealand, of course, we've got nothing to offer them. Other than Farm-Act, and people get a bit excited about that, but there's no question that Farm-Act is probably a bit of a negative for New Zealand in overall terms, although it's quite good for the taxpayer.
Talking about overall terms, how's the U.S. economy looking now with all of this money being printed and poured in? What are you thinking, Neville?
I think it's disastrous for the world. I mean, we heard James talking earlier about the impact on currencies, and it's really had a huge impact around the world. And I don't know if it's actually going to improve things in the United States. Wall Street certainly doesn't like it now, because all this cheap money has gone straight into Asia, where economies are growing really fast. That's where the money's gone. It hasn't stayed in America. So
if it doesn't work, 6 months from now, a year from now, what can we expect to see in the economy over in the States?
I think potentially a little bit more of what we're seeing right now. I don't know that it's going to be a slow grind from here in terms of the US economy, and looking forward to next year. Then there's not a lot to suggest that they're going to really tick up. And Nevil pointed out that initially there was so much activity from markets that were really excited about this new package, but now they're questioning what the impacts are going to be. And a lot of the developing countries are now saying, well, hang on, we've got all this money coming in. What happens when it runs out, or when investors want to take it out? Then we're going to see some asset slumps. So that's the risk, and that could have some big impacts on some of those smaller economies.
The world sees America as a consuming country, and they want to export to it. But there's been quite a strong growth with the low dollar for American exporters, but it's still only a tiny part of their economy. They export a very low level compared with, say, Germany or Japan.
Okay, let's talk about the biggest crisis we're facing right now, the kiwi fruit crisis. Apparently the disease has been confirmed, not only in the Bay Plenty now, but also in Hawke's Bay. 25 orchards quarantined. Potentially this is a disaster for us, isn't it, Neville?
Yes, well, ANZ Bank did an analysis and say it could be as high as $200 to $300 million worth of production lost in the longer term, and that's talking about $1.5 billion or more, so that's pretty serious.
How do you feel it's been handled by the government and by MAF and by the industry?
There seemed to be quite a belief in New Zealand that we're disease-free, and I think that's, and also the kiwi fruit industry is a monopoly, effectively. And when you combine complacency with a monopoly, if you're a believer in free markets and that sort of thing, you can see that a disease comes in that everyone, well, no one had heard of it until now except the growers. It comes in, it's probably been around for quite a while, and then suddenly there's an outbreak, and then it can be found everywhere. I wouldn't like to point the finger anywhere because there's pollination policies and that sort of thing, but it spreads easily, that's the point.
And it's airborne, and that's right. Once it gets out, it's a question of perhaps not eradicating it, but containing it. How much do you think the government's going to have to bail out the industry, James? I mean, we've seen them come into South Canterbury Finance. They've had to deal to the quake. Now this. Does a taxpayer owe the industry money to help them sort this problem?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, then the government can't front up for everything at every time. They don't have endless pockets, and there's plenty of governments around the world that would probably agree that governments can't bail everyone out. But there's got to be some give and take. The kiwi fruit industry is very important to our New Zealand economy. I think the governments, they're trying to find avenues to make sure that they're able to contain it and just assess the risk and see what the impact is really going to be. And there's no doubt that there's going to have to be some help, but what that is, it's hard to tell.
And talking about risk, what's the risk to our international good name, Neville?
Well, about half the kiwi fruit produced in the world has this disease. The other half doesn't. So that the risk is that the countries without it will see it as a way of limiting or banning imports. Although, like the fire blight that affects apples, it doesn't actually affect the fruit. But the problem is, I think, is that the media and other people have generated ideas that with less than scientific accuracy, that a lot of these diseases affect the fruit and that sort of thing, and so there's a kind of consumer view that if there's an outbreak of disease somewhere, it's going to affect the what they eat, and you know, that's a hard thing to combat.
Okay, let's go now to India if we can, and we see that Fonterra is going to put a pilot dairy farm in there. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, India is one of the largest growing markets in the world. We've already talked about China, Russia. I mean, India is right up there with those massive economies that are expanding. Dairy is very important. I think the key thing with the Indian market is that they've had dairy for a while, and you know, so their population's used to some of those dairy products. It's expanding rapidly and increasing wealth, so it's a good market to be involved in, as opposed to the Chinese market, who, you know, some people have not been exposed to dairy in the past. So you know, their appetite's just getting weirded.
And what's taken Fonterra so long to go into India? Do you wonder about that, Nevil?
Oh, well, you've got a big problem with a bit like the business culture in Russia, very hard market for Kiwis and Westerners to get into. But the High Commissioner for India was speaking at the Indian Business Awards earlier this week, and he pointed out that India has the world's largest dairy industry, and but a highly protected one. But what they really want is technology. And that's what New Zealand's going to offer. Whether the New Zealand public's not going to like it, because like the one they're setting up in China, it's all going to be done, you know, it's not going to be down outdoors with cows eating grass.
All right, yeah, it's going to be different.
It's going to be factory farming in a big way, and that's what the Indians want, because obviously they've got limited land use. You've got 1 billion odd people and a limited amount of land, and dairying has a big impact on the environment, and so you have to look at smarter ways of doing it. Yeah. Okay, well, stay tuned. That story's not going to go away. Coming up after the break, with summer just around the corner, Northland farmers are battening down for another drought. What's the economic impact likely to be? And a Wellington company using sheep gut in reconstructive surgery is the latest scientific advance finding favor in a multi-million-dollar market. But first, a question for you in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. How much has business lending fallen, and how much has farm lending risen in New Zealand since 2008? The answer when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much has business lending fallen and how much has farm lending risen in New Zealand since 2008? The answer, New Zealand business lending fell $9.3 billion to $71.5 billion, while farm lending jumped $4.9 billion to $48.3 billion. Let's talk first of all, James, about something that's coming up at the end of the month, the close of the prospectus for this new Wool Partners Cooperative. Where are we at with that?
Yeah, well, 2 weeks to go until it closes, and it's going to be a really close call as to whether it goes through or not. I mean, I've just been reading what's been happening in the media. Then it does seem like the sides are split as to where things are going to go, and you know, there's obviously some criteria to fill in terms of maintaining 50% share of the strong wool clip in the industry, and you know, I think farmers really have to decide whether they, you know, want to take a bit of a leap of faith and get involved in this. Obviously, over the past probably 5 years or more, then the wool industry has been sort of not doing so well. So, you know, we've got to take a bit of a leap of faith and try and change something and give it a go. Okay,
what do you think, Nevil? Is it worth giving it a go?
Well, certainly, wool industry is not something I know a lot about, but it's highly political, obviously. But I think there's another grouping as well, and so you know, they can only give it a go.
Yeah, the critics say, of course, a wool co-op is nothing like, for example, a dairy co-op. That this would look too much like a Fonterra. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Well, a dairy co-op is dealing with a product that you know, it has to be dealt with immediately, and that's the thing about milk. And whereas wool, you can hold on to it, you can build stockpiles. But what we don't have is any control over the end use of wool. That's the problem. It's a buyer's market.
Let's go up north now. Farmers are already battening down the hatches for another big dry. How devastating could this be if we see the same kind of conditions we saw last summer? James?
I think, yeah, it's, we're starting to get to a point. I think not only Northland, but around other parts of the country, the Waikato, lower North Island areas are really suffering at the moment. There's not a lot of grass around, and we were, you know, when we talk about dairy production, then there was predictions about big increases for dairy through this year as we recover from a drought and all those sorts of things. But you know, really the spring hasn't got off to a great start, and you know, production's probably going to be down. I think that could have an impact on the market. So there's those factors, as well as for the sheep guys, the beef guys, then you know, they're finding it hard. There's not a lot of sheep around, not a lot of beef around, and they're struggling to finish their stock at the moment.
You know, you travel all over the world, and whoever you talk to tells you that in their native lands, the weather conditions seem to be changing. Debate over as to why that is, of course. Neville, do you think that we have a good enough grip in this country about those changes moving forward? I mean, we are an agricultural powerhouse.
It's a very hard thing to predict, of course. That's one of the problems, and there's plenty of scientists working on just where the climate change is. I mean, Russia's had a drought, and that's almost unheard of, and they weren't ready for it. And we have dry spells quite a lot, but who knows? It could start raining next week.
Some good news now, of course, coming out of Wellington, of all places, a small company that has done some amazing work with sheep gut, and it's gotten FDA approval in the States, and it's going to be apparently huge for reconstructive surgery. That's got to be good, doesn't it, in terms of exports?
Yes, it is very hard to get these permissions. We've done it with honey, and also the use of animal bones and that sort of thing, and prosthetic surgery and that sort of thing. We could be a world leader in this, there's no question about it, and we've got very smart scientists working in it. But these companies are small by world standards, and you know, we still haven't solved the problem of how do we help these small companies become global, and the risks they have to take. And if it's just private money, obviously they work in a very slow and small manner.
So having a great idea and coming up with a gotcha moment isn't enough, is it?
No, and you know, we've got to be smart about who we tie up with. Obviously Americans would be very interested in this sort of stuff, but it's got world application, no question about that.
Thanks to my guests, ASB rural economist James Shortall and NBR editor Nevil Gibson. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please drop me a line on the website, and remember to check out my weekly blog. We'll give the last word to former American astronaut John Glenn, the first American to orbit Earth in the rocket ship called Friendship. He said, "As I hurtled through space, one thought kept crossing my mind. Every part of this rocket was supplied by the lowest bidder." Keep the faith. See you next time.